Hi, welcome to SHOWstudio. My name's Emily Zak, and today we'll be talking about Paris Fashion Week and Ann Demeulemeester's new collection. But before we start, I'll have my panel introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Lauren Cochrane. I'm the senior fashion writer at The Guardian.
My name's Ottilie, and I'm a freelance photographer.
Hi, I'm Nick Knight. I'm the director of SHOWstudio.
So what were the sort of initial thoughts on, I'm going to pronounce this once, and then we're going to shorten it immediately, this beautiful name, Ludovic de Saint Sernin, his first collection for Ann Demeulemeester, the storied house. I definitely saw some of the house codes. I felt like he was paying homage to the house, but it definitely felt like it was going in a different direction. Was the spirit there? Did we feel that there was a spirit that I certainly thought always existed for previous collections? What were your thoughts?
I was interested to see that, I didn't actually recognize his reference at the time, but the sort of gesture of the women holding their breasts is actually from one of her previous shows. And I thought it was, that's a sort of direct line, isn't it, to something that she has done. And I think that that was sort of seen in other ways through the show in sort of more subtle ways. He obviously had done his research, I think.
Yeah, when I saw the collection the first time, I thought there were loads of beautiful pieces. I agree with you. I think there was definitely an homage. There was a good mix of Ludovic's own style, but also a respect for the archive. And I think as much as I can appreciate a lot of the clothing, there was also a lack of clothing, I think, which is maybe something that I think is worth talking about a bit further.
Yeah, but I come to this in a slightly weird way because I knew of Ann Demeulemeester as a sort of, my wife would wear it. It was sold in a shop in Richmond for a long time. Yves On Demand had a shop halfway up Richmond Hill, which sold people like John Galliano and Ann Demeulemeester. And I sort of lived through all of that period, which was super inspiring. And my sort of feeling of Ann Demeulemeester was that she was an intellectual, that it was very sort of, in a way it's a sort of Patti Smith look that she was in some way represented, or if one wanted to sort of sum her up a little bit in terms of musical people, it'd be Patti Smith. And Ludovic comes from a very, very different place. And I think, like in some of these brands, when you get somebody taken over from the brand who seems to be so remarkably different from the aesthetic of the brand, I was a bit kind of, oh my God, what a strange kind of mixture. Why would you do that? Because Ludovic's all about kind of very sexual, very asexual vision, very sort of, it's a very sexual brand, and Ann Demeulemeester was a little bit not that. So it was seen to be an odd clash. But then I wonder, if she's Patti Smith, then is he Robert Mapplethorpe? And therefore, slightly kind of weird photographic history moment trying to compare. So does it make some sense in that way? Or is is that my sort of intellectualizing of it?
Yeah, I think that Ann Demeulemeester's collections in the past has been sexy. I think there's been a lot of. I think it's just that maybe Ludovic represents the other extreme of the spectrum. So if Ann Demeulemeester is somewhere in between, where she takes sort of like the everyday woman, the everyday scenario, and knows what a woman or a person maybe more so would like to wear in a variety of scenarios, Ludovic brings in just like, the party girl and this the
S&M references,
yeah.
the seven, there's this.
But he was very much into his kind of, wasn't he doing stuff on OnlyFans and kind of, on different porn sites and stuff like that. So it's very much his brand was very, very sexual and very straightforward, which is great. I'm not, it's what one chooses to articulate one's own life through one's work in whatever way one wants. But, it's a thing. I always felt a little bit weird, not always, I always felt, with Demeulemeester, it was a bit like a Belgian Yoji for me. So it was a bit like a Yoji Yamamoto who had some of those sort of values of kind of deep poetry and intellectual, etc., which is sort of weird. So I was almost sort of saying, and sex isn't that. Sex can be whatever we want it to be. But it did seem to me a little bit of a kind of cross thing. So sort of getting back to your original question, I actually did feel there was quite a lot of synergy between what he does and what she did. I'm just interested why on earth they chose him. What would have made them think, oh, I know the person to take over the brand, that guy who does the really sexy stuff. It's like so obvious. Why did they choose him? Does anybody know?
I mean, I don't know the exact reason why they chose him, but I think there's some interesting synergies between the previous creative director and Ludovic. So that may be part of the hint of, I couldn't find any posted reasons about why he was chosen, but I think there are some interesting connections, and I think that perhaps that gives us a little hint. So he comes from a menswear background, he's Belgian, even though he grew up in France. There are some sort of interesting connections on that front. There's this very hyper-sexualized focus on the male body. Again, that was the case for the previous creative director. So I wonder if that could have been some of what was sort of led us to this one. But I also wonder, like you made the point actually earlier when we were discussing this, that on one hand, this is like, when he's in interviews, Ludovic talks about, the annihilation of this difference between the genders in a way. But interestingly, like the men on the runway were in suits. So it's like, how do those things play in to just very traditional tropes, actually, in the end? Like, are they actually pushing some sort of a boundary for women, or is it just buying right back into some of the more traditional stereotypes?
Yeah, like why wouldn't he put a suit on one of the women walking down the catwalk? Why were there no shirts on the women? Why were there no tops on the women? Like, it would be so easy to add a top under some of the jackets, or there were lots of leather coats but still nothing underneath. I think there was maybe an opportunity missed a little bit here to build in some pieces that could have been actually just given the collection more depth, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you made the point, sorry, Lynn, you made the point earlier that Ann Demeulemeester always had like an intellectual quality. I'd be curious if you think that this collection did have that, or if it had that almost irony of like sexy but with a wink of an eye. It's not entirely what it looks like. There's a couple of layers. What do you think?
I think, I think there's several things with Ludovic. I think he's very good at, and he's very savvy, as anyone of his kind of generation is, about kind of making something that has a visual impact. And whatever you say about his collections, or indeed the collection for Demeulemeester, it does have that visual impact. We're all sitting around talking about it. It has that sort of like, you slightly stop when you're scrolling or whatever. And I think he's very aware of that. He's very good at that. And I also think there is a kind of level of sort of, I don't know how you sort of put this, like sort of like languid sexuality within his collections and within what she does, and I suppose that's exactly the thing that you come back to with kind of Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe. And Patti Smith is obviously like held up as this very, she's an extremely clever, extremely like gifted woman, but she also like, in those pictures, they are sort of low-key sexy. So I think there is maybe more of a kind of connection there that he will maybe explore as his collections for the brand kind of, there's more of them sort of thing.
Well, Patti Smith was Robert Mapplethorpe's girlfriend for a while. Yeah. I mean, they were deeply in love. There's a beautiful book, actually, about their affair, about their life together. I sort of think there's a sort of, an interesting thing that I didn't see what I wanted to say. I was apprehensive about the choice of Ludovic for this, simply because I didn't see the match. And then I felt it was almost too, like he tried too hard to match it in the end. I'd rather he didn't. I would rather it had been more him and less tribute to her, in a way. If you're going to go there, why don't you just let him become what he wants to become? Then you get into a whole discussion about what should brands do. Margiela put John there. Completely different designer aesthetically to Martin Margiela. But Karl Lagerfeld was put in Chanel. I mean, completely different character, Coco Chanel. So what do we want from our brand takeovers? Because all these brands realistically have their lifespan, don't they? The designers go old and die, and they have to be replaced, or they shut the business down. And then do you spend your whole time with the brand just making it look like a version of the first designer who created it, or do you go radically different, and do something, but then what's the brand about? It's very hard to know kind of how you make that balance, because Margiela under John looks very different to Margiela under Martin. So, you know, both are incredibly brilliant, I think. And I think they've probably got it right. I think you can sort of invest in a new identity for the brand rather than a sort of rehash. But it is hard. It's like opening your favourite bottle of wine and suddenly finding it tastes of something else. I'm not going to mention anything.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because you can sympathise with the pressure that comes with, you know, of kind of trying to sort of walk that balance for the first collection. You know, how much of myself do I put in it? How much of this heritage do I put in it? And I think it is a bit on the nose, isn't it? But I feel like he will develop and grow as he's sort of given more opportunity.
I hope so. I think so. They're a bit stuck with the Patti Smith thing. It's a bit ingrained, a bit like Audrey Hepburn is in Givenchy. They keep coming back to visit her, and it's like kind of, no, actually that's not. And then they check another designer who does, so it's a bit that swap, and I think they're a bit stuck with the Patti Smith thing with Ann Demeulemeester, which,
I guess it just depends on what the intention has been from the people who've decided that Ludovic should take over, because I suppose, do they want a new audience? Has their audience moved on? Is that why? There could be, you know, a very financial reason, which is often the reason behind something like that. And Ludovic is definitely someone who, you know, he attracts a lot of attention, and sex sells, and it always has. So in some ways you could also say maybe that is like I don't know.
Yeah, but it can be out of date. That's the problem. It didn't feel, and I could be a little bit critical, so Ludovic will hate me from now onwards. It felt a little bit not right. You know, it felt a little bit like there wasn't quite the vision of sex I wanted to see, which who cares? But you know, it just felt a bit. Do we really want to see that now? Isn't there something more interesting to say sexually, especially for Ludovic? I wanted to see something that felt a bit more out there, and that felt a little like reinforcing some of the things we're all a little bit wary of and don't want to see, and feels a bit grating. And there was some of that, the sort of very, very thin model.
This like idea that we're seeing on almost every show in Paris, right? The very, very super thin model, to your point.
Super thin model.
Transparent dresses, nipples showing.
It felt a little bit. That didn't feel fashionable or new or disturbing or whatever in the right way. It just felt a little bit, well, really, did you want to?
Yeah.
You know, isn't there something else we could have done? Is there, sexual horizons have really been opened up, fantastically in the last sort of 10 years. You know, it's great that people are finding new sexual identities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the physicality of the model is changing. We're seeing lots. It's a really exciting moment in that way. And then this feels a little bit like, well.
Yeah,
playing it safe.
It could also have been really interesting if he had dared to go a little bit more grungy, like if he had dared to mess it up a bit, and because all the girls, they do look, it's very elegant, it's very pretty, and I feel like maybe that's maybe where I think he could have taken a little bit more of the Ann Demeulemeester spirit, like by making it a little bit.
But he works with Paul. I mean, Ludwig has OnlyFans and everything else. So why isn't he looking at some of the sex workers or the porn workers to be his models?
Yeah,
incredible. So why isn't he using those people? If that's his milieu, then why not use that? That was what he was sort of bringing, this kind of honest approach to sexuality in the 21st century. And it's Grindr and Tinder and everything else. So why isn't that in there? So that's why I mean it feels a little bit like he was being a little bit of a good schoolboy and trying to do the right job, rather than actually being himself, which is kind of, if you're going to put him in the brand, let's have him, let's see it, and
I think it's also worth remembering the context that Ann Demeulemeester existed in. I read recently you couldn't, as a woman, you couldn't go to Claridge's in trousers in the 80s, which is sort of hard to believe. It's actually, if you imagine that she was coming into her own at a time when a lot of the ways women dress were much more rigid than they are now, obviously, right? So you see her archive collections and they look very relevant, they look like clothes that I would wear now that all of us would probably want to. And there is this irony and this way that she's twisting sexuality and what it is to dress like a woman. And it was very revolutionary at the time. So it's easy to forget that what she was what she was rebounding from, what the context was. And I think that's also interesting to think about, because when I look at the current collection, as you say, I think there's so much that he could be bouncing off of, and it just feels like it's choosing the safest option. But again, it's the first collection, so maybe this is, it's just getting, and many creative directors do that. They sort of play it safe the first collection, and then kind of really get into it the next collection.
I'd love to know the discussions that put these people in place. You know, who's deciding to have Ludovic? You know, is it just the business people? Is it just saying, okay, how do we make as much money as possible? Or is there a more artistic kind of decision-making process in play?
He had his own collection, obviously, but he was at Belmont, obviously, for a number of years. But you're right; it would be fascinating to understand what the thinking process was. But I think his tenure at building his own collection, but also his time at Belmont, I wonder if that had an influence.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, he's got experience actually working at a house, I suppose, was maybe a kind of plus in terms of CV.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, you know, with your earlier point that, like, you know, he is, if their customer is getting older and they want to kind of, you know, attract a new customer, he's an exciting design talent.
But then again, you risk losing that audience completely.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe that's fine.
And maybe that's okay.
There wasn't that bigger audience, I guess, in the first place.
Yeah.
So maybe, you know, that's fine to lose your older audience. You know, and also the older audience, you know, people like my wife who bought Ann Demeulemeester still have it. You know, it's still in the wardrobe because it's great. Any more than, you know, if you're sus, you don't get rid of your Galliano from the 90s or your Yoji or your Com, or you hold on to that stuff. And I think Ann Demeulemeester falls into that. So it's clothes you probably want to cherish. And they don't really go out of style. No. You know, if you like that style, they don't go out of style. You know, they still look great now. Yeah. So in a way, how many clothes do you want to have? If you're a lady of a certain age now and you bought stuff in the early 2000s, you're still going to look great in it.
I actually, to your point, I had a conversation with an executive at Kering, and he said, you know, I won't say the brand, but he was talking about a brand that they decided that they didn't need to talk to or speak to women, you know, above 40,
right.
Which was interesting to hear. And he said, you know, our focus really is young men, and that worked for them. I think it's still probably working for them. And so I think it's fascinating that a women's wear brand can really just decide that older woman, that woman who probably does have the most disposable income to buy it, maybe isn't their target, isn't the person they're going to try to speak to. I'm certainly not saying that that's the case for Ludovic. I'm just saying it's an interesting idea that you can design a women's wear collection that just doesn't think very much about a woman's body or how it changes or what
she wants to wear.
She wants to wear. And I think it's fascinating. Like I read, was listening to an interview with Christopher Kane about how he really uses his sister to bounce ideas off of. Yeah. I wonder if some of the best kind of design duos do have both kind of ideas at play.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's any other kind of examples of
that's where the muse comes in, isn't it?
Knowles, I mean,
Charlotte
Knowles, Chipova Luena. I mean, like, there's many up-and-coming brands as well that are duos, and they work really well together, and they support each other because they each add something, and one of them might be more for front of the brand, but it doesn't mean that the other person isn't as important.
Yeah,
that's traditionally where the muse comes in. Yeah. Sort of, you know, the designer's muse is this person that they dress. If they're a gay man, then they can't dress their lover, and they dress a woman who aspires, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting the difference. If you see, sort of Anne worked very closely with her husband, right, Patrick Robin. So I think again there are these kind of interlacing. You know, he was co-creative director. He put his career on hold to help her. Would her career have taken off? She was part of the Antwerp Six. Would it have taken off without that? It's a good question. I don't know. I think it's interesting also to think about Ann Demeulemeester herself right now, because I think it's a really interesting time. You have Phoebe Philo announcing her return, Martine Sidbon, the French designer, also returning. So it's this interesting moment in time. I mean, perhaps they should have chosen Anne to come back to rethink the.
She just don't want to. She wants to do ceramics.
She wanted to do her ceramics collection. Yeah, indeed.
I mean, in a way, is that like not a kind of a flex in and of itself. You know, oh no, I don't want to design clothes anymore. Yeah. I mean,
well, I think the pandemic did that to everybody, didn't it? It made us all think, what the hell are we doing? You know, and some people thought, I want to do something else. I don't want to do this all the time. You know, a designer's life is not fun. You know, you get caught up in these kind of commercial cycles of delivering clothes, designing clothes, selling. It's not a fun lifestyle. It's a very, very, very hard lifestyle. And, you know, one could quite naturally, when thinking, I'd like to appreciate other parts of my life. So, I think the pandemic's been quite a weird thing. And I think we're seeing the cultural ramifications of that sort of starting to play out in all the different industries. So, I'm not sure.
I suppose even if you think about Phoebe's return, I mean, she's obviously, you know, it was announced a long time ago and then it's finally actually happening. And I think she's probably been thinking, you know, hard about how she wants to do that. You know, it's very much on her terms, which is, and I think she's spoken before about how she's found, you know, the pressure of being a designer and kind of doing, you know, having a family and a personal life, you know, balancing all of that is quite difficult. And like, the fact that she's done it in this way maybe is also part of the sort of post-pandemic slow thinking.
Is that what it's called?
I don't know. I mean,
I get quite slow thinking. It's got brain fog.
But do you think you can, as a creative, I mean, I'd love to know what you think for yourself, Nick. As a creative, do you feel like, I mean, she was an incredible talent, obviously, still is. And she's transferred some of that creative talent. I mean, in an interview, I think it was right in 2013 when she was leaving the house, and someone, you know, are you devastated? Are you terribly sad about leaving? And her answer, and it's not verbatim, but it was something along the lines of, no, I'm thrilled. I get to be creative again. To your point, that she obviously felt that stepping back would give her that space to be creative. Yeah. And I'm interested in how, you know, are these kind of creative skills transferable? Can they be? Obviously, she's proven that they can be, but it's sort of an interesting way of thinking, like that it's not specific. It's just fashion just happens to be how she's expressing or how she used to express.
Absolutely, that's the whole point of an artist. You should be able to express yourself in whatever medium you choose. I mean, theoretically, we obviously, some people are better at certain things. But, you know, you have lots of polymaths or generalists, you know, who can do many different things. You know, you have singing, porcelain making, you know, painting, sculpting, you know, all those sorts of things. They're all up for grabs. And now with AI, they're really up for grabs. You know, so we can do virtually everything. When nothing is off limits to us now. So I'm all for it. So you know, an artist, whether it's a fashion designer or a painter or whatever, should absolutely be encouraged to look at the different ways to express themselves. But
yeah, I was thinking about, you know, what other female designers, like, I don't know, thinking about what it means to have a male designer, a creative director, and a female creative director, and what it means for the way we perceive a collection is quite interesting, because let's say, I don't know, Moa Lola, for instance, she makes incredibly sexy collections, and it, you know, I don't think there's nothing wrong with making a sexy collection. It's just more like, what do you think about, like, how you, does it changes the way you kind of see or experience this collection?
What are you saying there?
Would it be different if it had been a female creative director who made an incredibly sexy collection? Or
I mean, theoretically, no, it shouldn't make any difference, but it almost certainly would. I mean, there's a sort of weird thing about sex. It's in some ways, it's not recognised as a great thing. You know, people always say, "Oh, it's a very sexy collection," but is it really about sex, or is it about some sort of cliches of sex? You know, we don't talk enough about sex. We're terrified of talking about it. We're terrified of showing it. We're terrified. So it's a rather hard one to sort of really put out there. You know, and I think, you know, I grew up in the 1970s when sex was talked about much more prevalent, and et cetera, and then between, you know, dreadful advent of AIDS and then the sort of stupid censorship that's coming with the social media, we've sort of buried it again. And I think it's about time that we did start to have openly and pro-sexual conversations. So I'd be delighted to see sexual conversations on the catwalk. But it does feel sometimes, and this goes back to, I guess, some sort of part of my upbringing, one shouldn't. You know, it's a little bit like, well, it can be very reserved and intellectualize it, but one actually shouldn't be very sexual. But you know, I was born in 1958. You know, it was pre the kind of, you know, cultural revolution of the 1960s. You know, pre-free love, pre the pill for women, etc., etc., etc. So I have sort of lived through those different moments, and this feels like there was a bubble from the mid-60s to the kind of end of the 70s of sexual liberation, where people were indulging and talking about. So look at fashion photography of the time. It was all about sex, of every aspect of it, and then it just got all, you know, has been shut down, partly through AIDS, dreadfully, partly through commercialization of fashion, through, you know, American Vogue and all of LVMH and all those sorts of things. Let's sell, so let's get rid of anything that's a bit worrying. And then partly full of the kind of, you know, the opinions that come with social media and everybody able to say things, and then the kind of, you know, the Facebooks and the Instagrams and everything else saying we can't show a woman's nipple because it's a sin. Where the fuck are we now?
Maybe there's also a difference. We have to differentiate between body positivity and sexuality. Like, it's not always linked with each other. Like,
No,
you know,
you're right.
because you can also wear, you know, a really, you know, I think there's a huge difference, and I think it's also very much about what type of model do you cast, what is it you're trying to say with putting on very little clothes, because, you know, we shouldn't sexualize someone just because they necessarily wear a transparent dress. It's just that, you know, it's kind of...
It seems a little bit easy. I think it's an easy, it doesn't take that much effort to think that that's sexy. It's an obvious choice. And I think what is interesting in what you've both said, and I think this is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, is the kind of one-noteness of it. That if sexuality is as complex and as nuanced as I think it is, then surely there's a lot of different ways to express it. And by choosing one body type, as in the models being all very thin, very Anglo, mostly white, I think if not all white, I'm sure there must have been some models of color, but very, very white. What is that saying about what sexiness is? And I think that's a hard, I realize probably for a new creative director of a more established house with a very long reputation as being run by Anne herself, maybe that's a very hard hurdle to clear. But I also think it's just interesting that, you know, you asked whether it makes a difference, whether it's a female creative director or a male. I think it does, largely because even if the female creative director is not thinking of herself, we presume that on some level she's bringing something a little more subtle into the mix, into the statement. And I think that's what's maybe missing for me in this collection, is the subtlety. What is the second note? What's the third note? It feels very...
Okay, so playing devil's advocate, what about Donatella Versace? You know, that she makes incredibly sexy collections.
I don't think the sexiness is the issue. It's more about what else is being said with the sexiness. Are there models that are curvier?
But I mean, I think there's two things there, isn't it? Like you said, like it's about body types and it's about sexuality. So, you know, they obviously come together quite a lot of the time, but they're not always together. It's two separate points, I think.
And weirdly, I don't think these models are particularly sexy. I'm absolutely sure they're delightful people and very sexy in their own right. But the image that they're giving off is a little bit more innocent in a way. It's sort of slightly pre-Raphaelite kind of. You know, it's quite delicate in that way, which didn't expect him to do. You know, I think you make a very good point. You know, I think it just feels to me like it's not challenging. It's something that feels a little frustrating. And I would love to know that, you know, because we are looking at this collection and talking about the model's body shapes. So we're not talking about the cut of the cloth. We're not talking about the range of colours. We're not talking about any of the sort of actual fashion. We're talking about the presentation of it in terms of what models it was put on. And I'm not saying we're wrong to talk about it in that way, because that's what's being shown to us, and that's what seems to be relevant to us. So it sort of seems to me that slightly odd that you know, what decision was he making by doing that? He can't have been innocent of that decision. He can't say, oh yes, we'll just get a casting director and I won't pay attention. He must have said, this is the sort of woman I want to have, but I'd love to know why.
They look a lot like him.
Do you think it's just sort of designer's narcissism?
I don't know. I think we can't help but we all have biases. I mean, we all have them.
For sure, I'm not knocking it.
I just think it's uncanny that they all look a lot like him. This one in particular is, I think, a male, but very feminized looking, very delicate features, to your point. So I think a lot of the models do look very similar to him. I don't know if that was intentional.
And there's that weird thing, sorry, just keep blubbering in. There's that weird thing when designers, a lot of designers, I won't be so ungentlemanly to mention any names, a lot of designers physically change themselves, and really quite profoundly. And I think there are a few famous examples of that. And is that because they want to look like the women that they dress? Is it a sort of becoming that person? You know, it's a sort of, I think it must be a very strange job to spend your whole time working so closely on the aesthetics of the body. And then you look at yourself and you think...
I think this is a huge discussion, actually. It's that we could almost talk about even longer than this show, because it's ingrained in a whole infrastructure of how the industry is built and what we see as the beauty and what we idealize as the perfect body. Because clearly the industry is not ready for different types of bodies.
But that's the thing. It's the industry which is the unpleasant flavour here.
Yeah.
It's the money. Emily will know that I'm a sort of...
Yeah, no, exactly. That's what it is about.
More and more left in my own politics. But I find that the distorting thing here. And that's why I keep saying, what was the business decisions? Why would they do this, et cetera, et cetera? Because, you know, it's the industry that the thing is, okay, what will sell most? And that's not the same as what will make great clothes.
Yeah.
So...
And also what's easier to sell.
Yeah.
What's easier to make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It might be a good time for us
capitalism.
to take... I think this is a perfect time to take some questions from our audience that they were posted earlier. So the first one I think fits perfectly a segue into what we were just saying. So I'm going to start with this one. Sorry, apologies if I butcher this. How to understand the gesture of models walking on the runway, feeling cold or sexualized. I think what that question means is, what are we to think of the kind of tone or timbre of the model's attitude themselves, walking on this particular show or just in general, I'm not sure. But let's take this show to start with. And I do think that there is a noticeable difference, probably starting with Demna, starting with that kind of aggressive, that very mean-looking expression, walking really fast. What do we think of that? Let's answer. What do you think?
I wonder if when it sort of first began, this kind of, I don't know what you call it, I'm going to call it a stompy walk. It's a stompy walk
works
stompy
for
walk.
me. Yeah.
It sort of was about kind of disrupting the idea, the kind of, the supermodel sort of gliding down the catwalk. Right. Terrible impression, but you know what I mean. And maybe
the supers.
Yeah, the sort of the ones trained by J. Alexander and all that sort of that whole idea. And maybe it sort of was about sort of, I don't know, kind of disrupting that and also sort of making people realise how absurd the whole idea of a catwalk show is, and the idea of these people walking down a runway and sort of taking away the kind of, I suppose, like the romance of it or something. But now it's become like a trope, hasn't it? So it's almost like we don't see it so much anymore because it's become
so ubiquitous.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It has become a little
bit.
Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I suppose I agree a lot on what you're saying. I don't know. I feel like it's maybe, I don't know. I'm actually not really sure. I'm gonna hear what you guys say, because I think you're right that it is it's a trend, and I think it's it makes them look cool. But other than that, I can't really say.
I just remember being 14 and I felt like I was really cool. I had a punk hairstyle and I would walk in my town kind of like that and feel just so amazing. I feel like that's some of what I think is happening there. It's this self-contained universe of da, da, da.
So you think it's a power walk?
Yeah, totally think it's a power walk.
Okay, well that's good.
But in a very awkward kind of
An awkward power walk.
An awkward power walk.
It's different things, and they bring you back to sort of Pat Cleveland on the runway for Mugler in the 70s. It was a bit of theatre. And I know from working with John Galliano that he tells each model a character that they are before they put a foot on the runway. So they are somebody walking down that runway.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't appear to be the case here, but it's just different, different strokes for different folks. And also fashion's what it is. We talk about the supers, but that was, it might as well have been 1850. It was so long. With all due respect. But it's not current anymore. Kids who are sort of 16 now, like you said, you were 14, and you were kind of engaging in a sort of personal kind of style thing. So we really, kids are 14. What do they get excited by now? My guess is they're not even looking at this. But I don't find a walk particularly. You got some of those. I can't remember when it was, like 10 years ago. So you got some of that feeling that they were just anything not to interrupt the clothes. So no expression, no sort of animation of the clothes. Literally walking coat hangers that would go out anonymously, and that was a thing. That became fashionable because it was a reaction against something else. And then there's that's what fashion does. Sort of, and then somebody say, oh no, I want everybody to be like Pat Cleveland, and then somebody will do something else. Fantastic, and this is not because Ottilie's here, but Sinead O'Dwyer's, look at that for catwalk. Amazing.
Yeah.
Really, and that sort of felt current. So that, and that's where we are now. So this doesn't feel very. It just feels like okay.
What's next?
What's next? So
Next.
why do we?
Creative directors, next.
Well, it's a bit just like why? Why are you showing it like this? It's not strong enough for me to understand that, and it rings a few alarm bells in me when I see a lot of very skinny young models walking down, sort of slightly being exposed. But it's not really. But fine. But everybody has different visions of stuff. We talk about sex, but every single one of us in this room has a different version of sex. Every one of us have a different thing we like, and it isn't classified by anything.
Right.
And we're in a time where we're going transgender, which is fantastic. It'll be trans species, trans object, which is great.
Transhuman.
Transhuman, absolutely, because that's where evolution goes. So without getting on my God's soapbox and starting saying where we're all going as a species, but that's progress. That's fashion. Fashion should be leading us. That's what fashion's about, predicting what you want in 6 months' time. It's a future positive, it's a future predictive medium. So we don't want to see something that feels a bit like kind of, huh? You want to see something that goes, wow. Want to be blown away. And Ludic's capable of that, and Ann Demeulemeester is capable of that. So I guess my frustration is it feels a little bit too well brought up and a bit too respectful and a bit too, well, actually, why couldn't he just be more than what he wanted to be? And if it's just to sell more clothes, is that really what we want out of life? No.
But maybe now that you've opened up for the Sinead O'Dwyer box, I would say that maybe comparing the two in terms of the casting, his show is about the anonymous side of, like, he doesn't want it to be about the model, whereas that's exactly what Sinead's show is about.
But then we spent the whole thing discussing the models.
But I was going to make that point earlier. I think whatever models you have, we're going to talk about the models because it's such a kind of talking point at the moment. It's such a hot button topic, isn't it?
Well, especially if you're showing the whole body, and if the clothes you're making are about the model's body, then that's an important talking point.
Sorry, again.
If your clothes are showing the model's body, you made this point earlier, then we have to talk about that. What body are you choosing to show? I mean, we're seeing now, I think pregnancy was we saw a lot of kind of pregnancy-themed shows popping up, and for me, I thought that was really interesting because there, as a woman, I think there's this kind of period where a woman's body is this highly sexualized, commodified, really up until 30. And then anything, after childbirth, when you're pregnant, when you're older, that's not interesting to most male creative directors, not interesting. So it's like, how do fashion brands bring in the softness of a woman's body, the curve of pregnancy?
Then you be careful, because then you slip into saying when a woman's pregnant, she's no longer sexual. And that's a Madonna complex. A lot of, in Italian culture, they find very difficult. I remember doing a Pirelli calendar once, and I had a pregnant woman in the Pirelli calendar, and Pirelli, who are Italian, were like, oh, this is the Madonna. What are you doing? It's a mother figure. You can't sexualize her. Just because I can't tell you.
No, I agree completely that is sexy, but I guess, you can thank Rihanna for that, right? Like, I agree that that's super sexy, but why is this very pre-adolescent, adolescent body type the primary, for most designers and most male creative directors? I think that is what we're marketed. So I agree with you. I think a woman's body when she's pregnant is incredibly sexy. And even, what about all the softnesses? What about the wrinkles and the folds? I don't see a lot of creative directors, male or female, frankly, embracing that.
No, you've got a big thing to fight against there. It's the whole thing of kind of, people, not indulging what humanity is and sort of indulging a sort of, slightly kind of, boring version of, to be honest. It's more fun with the kind of, the weird bits. That's what makes life sexy. It's not the kind of, nobody wants to look perfect. None of us, fall in love with somebody because they have symmetrical nostrils, or we fall in love with people because they're weird fucks. Because people are odd and different.
But then
that's what's charming.
That brings it back to what kind of person are they designing for? Who's the clothes made for? Because if you don't design clothes that's going to fit, a woman who's a bit older has more curves, and she's not going to wear a dress, as you said earlier as well, that has like a full open stomach, because she's just not going to feel comfortable in that. Or maybe she does. Maybe a few people would, but it's just not most women who would.
I think there's also an economy of attention, where you, if you're as a woman, if you have to pay attention to where your tits are and what you're wearing, sorry to be crude, and what are you not thinking about? What are you not able to think about? If you're worried about some part of your dress not holding where it should, what is your brain not able to think about? I'm guessing quite a lot, actually. So I think this idea of like, what as a woman, what are your clothes enabling you to do? And I guess I would ask Ludovic, what are your clothes enabling women to do?
I would love to know, if Ludovic watches this, what he thinks we've missed. Because I'm sure he does.
Yeah, I'm sure we have missed
I'm sure he'll
something.
think you've over blah, blah, blah about models, you've talked about this, that and the other. What's he proud of in the collection? That's not a dismissive thing, that's a question. I wonder if we take a different for a moment, what are the most beautiful parts of this collection? Is it the colour range? Is it the fabrics? Is it the lengths? Is it how they move? Is it how they cut, etc.? I wonder if we, for a moment, just look at the fashion in there. What we can take away in a positive, because we're all critics, so we're criticising, which is fine. Easy to criticise and worth criticising. Fashion designers need to hear criticism, all of them, because it's been far too long we've been in a medium that hasn't had any critical forum. But that being said, I wonder in this collection, if we were to look for one positive thing, not one positive, but some positive things. I wonder what I'll tell you why I say this. It's because when I first started doing these panels, John Galliano phoned me afterwards and said, you spoke all the way through the collections when it was showing on television, that's very rude of you, and also you didn't talk about the clothes. You talk about everything other than the clothes, and these are selection of clothes. So I wonder if we do that honour to Ludovic, what we think is the kind of, is it the palette or the...
I loved all those little signatures at the cuffs showing. That's very Anne. I mean, I have an original, shirt that has that. Love that. I love all those house signatures, and I do think he did that well. And I think probably for him, that was his primary achievement, and that's okay. And I think I'd be really curious to see how those evolve for next season.
Sorry, I personally actually quite like the collection. Maybe I'm in the minority.
Not at all.
Yeah. And I like his work. I think he's a good designer. I think he's got his handbrake on in this collection, is my general thinking. And I think some of it is very Anne. I mean, even if you sort of, disregarding the body type debate, all of these sort of very sort of fluid kind of, diaphanous fabrics feel very her, and then also quite him, because he's used quite a lot of transparent fabrics in his collections. And I think there is quite a lot of stuff that has been sort of transferred from his aesthetic. I agree. I think he should just push it a bit more. That would be my kind of general note.
Any final thought? We can leave with our...
Yeah, I also have to say I enjoyed lots of elements from the collection. I mean, I'm a big fan of the whole leather element, and I think the tailoring and the long cuffs as well. Again, it's just about the context, and I think it's about thinking more about I think the casting is important. I think that's why we've been talking so much about it. And I think that if he had maybe challenged his own way of viewing the ideal body and the ideal, maybe if I don't know, maybe it's just me being maybe I just don't relate to the way he chooses to present his collection, because I think that the actual garment quality is there.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
there's a real, as I said, it's a sort of exercise really. Let's put away our concerns and be non-critical of the casting and the et cetera, et cetera. we just look at the garments, there are some objectively beautiful pieces of clothing there.
Yeah.
That if I was a different person, I would be thrilled to wear. And if I was with somebody who's wearing them, I would be in admiration and in awe of them wearing it, because they would look beautiful. So he's succeeded in making some beautiful clothes, and some clothes which are very desirable. Again, if I were to put the kind of whole body issue to one side, and I do it quite consciously so I can get to the clothes. But I think objectively there's some beautiful pieces of clothing there, and some interesting things. I would be thrilled to be in the company of somebody wearing those clothes.
Well, maybe then we can finish on our last thought, which is we're maybe all interested and excited to see what he does next.
Yes, yes.
And I think with that, we might have to finish. But thank you so much for joining us.